We might think our modern justice system is harsh sometimes, but imagine living in an era where a small crime didn't just mean a fine or some jail time. Nope, it meant a public spectacle of just unimaginable pain. So let's pull back the curtain on history and take a look at what used to pass for justice. Yeah, just let that one sink in. Stealing a pair of shoes. The consequence for that could be a punishment so extreme we can barely even wrap our heads around it today. And this wasn't for some huge, terrible crime. This was the reality for everyday stuff. And here's the really wild part. This wasn't some rogue torturer getting carried away. This was the law. State-sanctioned justice, written down, approved, and carried out in front of cheering crowds like it was some kind of sporting event. So, to try and make sense of all this, we're going to explore some of history's most, let's call them creative punishments. And look, we're not ranking these for fun, but to really understand the different levels of calculated cruelty that humans were capable of. Okay, first up, we're looking at punishments that were less about putting on a show and more about a kind of systematic, almost scientific application of pain. These were devices and methods designed for a very specific, very brutal purpose, often for getting information or for crimes that were seen as just deeply unnatural. Take the iron boot, pure mechanical horror, usually used during interrogations. Your leg would get locked into this heavy metal casing. Then they'd hammer these thick wedges in, one by one, squeezing your flesh and just shattering the bone. The whole point was to systematically turn your leg into pulp. And if that wasn't enough, some versions had a spot for hot coals, so you're literally being grilled and crushed at the same time. And then there's this one from ancient Rome, which is just as bizarre as it is terrifying. If you committed parricide, that's killing your own parent, you got the punishment of the sack. You were sewn up inside a leather bag with a dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster, and then the whole thing was tossed into a river. So what was the logic here? Well, it's this really twisted symbolism. The Romans thought the absolute chaos of those terrified animals clawing and biting inside the dark sack, it mirrored the chaos of the crime itself. So you weren't just drowning, you were being mauled by frantic creatures in the dark, a punishment meant to reflect the horror of turning on your own family. But, punishment wasn't always done behind closed doors. This next group of punishments evolved into a full-blown public performance. This was the theater of pain, where suffering was the main event, and it was all designed to send a really powerful message of fear to everyone watching. The breaking wheel. This was a masterpiece of making agony last as long as possible. The goal was absolutely not to kill you quickly. An executioner would shatter your arms and legs one by one with this huge iron club, being super careful to avoid a fatal blow. Then, your now broken, bendable body was woven through the spokes of the wheel. And then they'd hoist the whole thing up on a pole for the whole town to see, leaving you to die from shock and thirst over hours, sometimes even days. This one you've probably heard of. It was reserved for high treason in England, and it was basically a 4-act play of pure brutality. First, you're dragged through the streets by a horse. Then you're hanged, but only until you're almost dead. Then, while you're still conscious, you're cut open and disemboweled, often with your organs burned right in front of your eyes. And only then were you finally beheaded and your body chopped into 4 pieces, which were then put on display around the kingdom as a pretty gruesome warning. All right, this next invention from ancient Greece was an execution device and an instrument of pure terror. So a person was locked inside this giant hollow bronze bull, and a fire was lit underneath to slowly roast them alive. But here's the real genius and the horror of it. The bull's head was designed with a system of tubes so that the victim's screams were transformed into what sounded like the roaring of an actual bull for the crowd's entertainment. And here's the kicker. In a moment of really grim poetic justice, the tyrant who ordered the bull to be made was so disturbed by how well it worked, he decided to test it out on the inventor, Perillos. I guess that's a lesson in not gifting high-tech murder weapons to powerful people. The horror of the oubliette was all in your head. The name literally comes from the French word to forget. And that was the whole point. You weren't really executed, you were just erased. You'd be dropped into this pitch-black vertical shaft with no way to climb out and just left there.
left to die of hunger or thirst, or just go insane in the total darkness, completely forgotten by the world.
And now, we get to the final level. These are the methods that are so cruel, so drawn out, they really are the absolute peak of human depravity. What defines these isn't active violence. It's their slow, passive nature, where the victim's own body and the world around them become the instruments of torture. Bamboo torture is just horrifying because of how passive it is, right? There's no executioner swinging an axe. It's just nature. The victim would be tied down over a bed of sharpened bamboo shoots. Now, some bamboo species can grow incredibly fast, and they're strong enough to pierce right through human flesh. So the person could only lie there, totally helpless, as the plant slowly but relentlessly grew right up and through them. I mean, just look at this timeline. It shows you the horrifying progression. This was not a quick death. It was an agonizing process that stretched on for days. On day 1, the skin is broken. Day 2, the shoots are driving through muscle and nerves. And by day 3, they're skewering your internal organs. It is an inch-by-inch execution, delivered by the earth itself.
And finally, scaphism. This might just be the most vile punishment ever thought up. Okay, so a person was trapped between 2 hollowed-out boats, with just their head, arms, and legs sticking out. Then they were force-fed milk and honey until they had violent diarrhea. At the same time, their body was smeared with that same mixture to attract insects. Left in a stagnant swamp, they were slowly eaten alive as their own filth attracted more and more bugs. And those daily feedings? That wasn't mercy. That was just to make the whole thing last longer.
17! That's how many days one man is said to have survived this. 17 days of being consumed from the outside in, literally rotting while still alive, surrounded by your own filth. The amount of suffering in that length of time it's just something you can't even imagine. So what do we take away from all this horror? I think it's that these punishments show a really terrifying dark side of human ingenuity. The same creativity that builds entire civilizations and creates beautiful art was also used to design these incredibly intricate systems of pain. It's an ingenuity that came from a need to control people, to make an example, and maybe to express a society's deepest fears.
And all of this, it leads to one final, really unsettling question. For the people who practice these things, this wasn't sadism, it was justice. It makes you wonder, as we evolve, where do we draw that line today? And you have to ask, how will future generations look back on the punishments of our time?